Okay. So this is one of those stories that I find interesting. It's the type of thing where you say, so did you like that story? Well, I guess like is not really the word you'd want to use because the story was sort of, the way it was, the whole story, the stories in that story, it was all just sort of a mean and nasty story in general. This is one of those stories where you don't have to like the content, but the way it's told, the way it's presented, the actual like artistry of it, you can like that. So it's like going to a sad movie and bawling through the whole movie and saying, "Oh, it was so good, and now it's so sad." Well, why is it good if you're so sad? Well, because it had that effect, right? This is a story like that. It is spicy. Not in the sense that it's spicy because it kind of hurts when you read it, but it tastes good, metaphorically, like soup that's really hot and spicy, but it still tastes good. Okay. And when I look at your posts, what I'm seeing, different phrasing and different sort of competent phrasing of it. It's not like you're just copying each other. People are saying that basically it's spicy. These stories aren't moral. They aren't what we want to hear from the men protecting our country. We are not hearing examples of perfect behavior. We are not seeing people, what's the term? If you're morally, if the story is morally redeeming, then it's a lie. It's fake, right? Because real stories aren't morally redeeming. You hear about real people doing real crap, and that's real, right? And if a war story embarrasses you, he says, then it's real. Okay. And the cool thing, I mean, it doesn't take long for that to click in your head. If you think about some of the stories that you learn the most from in your life, your personal narratives or the stories that mean the most, they're often they are not the stories that are particularly enjoyable, right? It doesn't take long to think of something where, oh yeah, I know a lot about what reality is or about what I am because of that one time that I certainly am not going to tell you about because it was like freaking humiliating. I'm never going to talk about that in public, but it's one of the biggest stories in my head, right? We all have those. And what he's saying here is that he says that's a true war story. The difference is he's writing them. He's telling you them. Okay. So that's one of the themes, one of the ideas in this particular story, which is actually a small collection of stories. Some of the things that he says about storytelling, that's sort of content comments are things that you made. Okay. He also, since he's talking about storytelling, he also talks about the telling of the story. And he says things like this. It's difficult to separate what happened from what seemed to happen. That's just seems weird. What seemed to happen shouldn't matter. No. What seemed to happen is your perception of what happened. That's really the only thing that matters. Okay? The way he explains how stories work, what seems to happen is just as important or maybe even more than what really happened. Okay. So difficulty between separating what happened from what seemed to happen, that makes sense. And we look back at at Spin, where he says, so the memories are up in your head, and then all of a sudden you get a little bit of imagination in it, and boom, it turns into a story. So when you add the fake, it becomes real. I guess, yeah. Right? And that fits with this. It's hard to tell between what happened and what seems to happen. And that actually is what sort of makes it a good story. There's always that surreal seemingness, which makes the story seem untrue, but which in fact represents the hard and exact truth. as it seemed. Ding. Okay. He says a true war story cannot be believed. That's why it's true. A little bit contradictory, but intuitively we can see how that makes sense. And then he says some interesting things. He says you can't even tell it. It's just beyond telling. A true war story is beyond telling. You can't even tell it. And that true war story there, he's talking about the actual experience, right? And remember, whenever he says war story, he's really just saying story, right? Because the only reason his stories are about war is because that's the thing he has to tell about. His book is not about war, it's about stories. Just so happens all of his stories are war stories, okay? Just a reminder of that. But yeah, he says you can't even tell it. It's beyond telling sometimes. Well, so that makes it awkward when you're trying to read or receive stories, right? If the person can't even tell it, then think of the reader. The reader has to hear it or read it in order to get the story. But he hasn't even said anything about the reader. We'll get back to that. So then he gives this example of Sanders telling a true war story. And this war story is God's Truth on page 68. And then on page 69, one of the things in the story that makes it so, I don't know, scary or awful or wretched for them is that, page 69, it says the poor dudes can't even horse around like normal. They can't joke it away. They can't talk to each other. They can't tell each other what's going on. And that's what makes it the worst. So they can't talk about it, which makes it worse to experience it. Maybe that's why he's always talking about the storyteller, not the listener. The listener isn't really the person who's important here. It's the teller, because they have to tell in order to process. These poor guys couldn't do it. What happened to them? They went freaking crazy. Sanders tells a story about these guys going wacko in the hills because they couldn't tell their stories, at least in part, because they couldn't tell stories, right? And then at the end, he says, this is all true. On page 72, he says, this is all true, but certain stories you don't ever tell. And then on page 73, he says, yeah, I made up a bunch of that stuff, but it's still true. Okay. That fits with what we see from the author. The stuff you make up, the part that seems right, that's what makes it a true war story. Now, a couple other things he says here. He says a true war story, if truly told, makes the stomach believe. If the story is told truly, then your stomach believes it, not your head. And this is sort of an interesting notion when we talk about the way we understand things as normal human beings. You sometimes will talk about understanding something with our brain or understanding something with our heart, or we got a gut feeling, and that's what he's sort of drawing the distinction of here. If you connect these two ideas here to seeming, what really happened, what seemed to happen, what really happened is the head, objective, actual, real thing that happened. But that's not really the important part. What really matters is how you felt about what happened, the feeling of it in your heart rather than in your head, or what he says here, your stomach. You get a gut feeling. Okay, so he's calling on an idiom, right? A figure of speech that we're familiar with. If it makes your stomach believe, if you feel it deep down inside, even if technically, scientifically, it didn't happen that way, that's not what matters. It's the heart, the stomach. And then he says, this one does it for me. And the phrasing here, a true story, if truly told, makes the stomach believe. This one does it for me. I've told it before many times, but here's what actually happened. Interesting phrasing here. He does not say a true story, if you hear it told right, makes your stomach believe. He's saying that to us, the reader. That's what we understand when we read that through. But it's also saying a true war story, if you tell it right, makes the stomach believe. This one does it for me. I've told it before. Wait a minute. I've told it before. So this is a story, if told well, makes the stomach believe. I know because I've told this one and it makes the stomach believe. Again, it's like ambiguity. It's not the listener, it's the teller. That's his concentration. Does that mean the listener doesn't matter? Well, if the listener didn't matter, he would not write the book. We would not be reading the book, right? It's sort of it's that willingness to hear what the author is saying and to sort of recognize that he's got a persona that's talking to us, but that persona is giving us this understanding. It makes a difference when we try and tell our stories if we look at him telling his story this way and sort of disregarding the reader, the listener. Then we can approach it that way. We understand his experience. And this is the one where he talks about Rat Kiley and Lemon, which is, I don't really warn people. I said something about there's naughty words in it. Yeah, there's naughty words in it. And then there's a whole bunch of like massive animal abuse. Well, one big example, right? So it's a hideous kind of story. And if you're not ready for it, then it kind of punches you in the stomach and you go, holy crap, right? And that's, it then makes perfect sense. It fits with the story. That's the real Rat Kiley. That's Rat Kiley. I don't know if you recall this. Do you remember, anyone remember what Rat Kiley does in the squadron? Do you remember what his role is in the squad? If you can remember, it's kind of an interesting relationship. I mean, if you don't remember, when you see, you'll go, really? And if you do remember, you're probably going, yeah, that is kind of weird. What is Rat Kiley in the squad? He's the freaking medic. He's the guy who saves the people who get shot. And when this happens to his buddy, he goes off the rails. Okay. Yeah, he's the medic. Okay. So that helps drive it home, right? Now I just gotta say on the side, because we know the guy writing the book, was it necessarily when he was in Vietnam and somebody cracked the real thing, was he a medic? We don't know. But when the storyteller makes him the medic, that makes the story more impactful, doesn't it? That's the kind of decision that he can do that makes the story make sense, even make more sense, whether or not it's true. Okay. We hear about the storyteller telling the story. We kind of talked about this already, but just a reminder, because of the title of this chapter, it's how to tell a true war story. It's not how to tell if a war story is true. So this is the way you tell a story. So again, the author is he does it subtly. If you zip through, honestly, the very first time I read this book, I wasn't teaching it. And I read it, and it never really stuck that he's talking about telling all the time. He's talking about talking. He's talking about the author's position. And once you start paying attention to it, you see it all the time, all over the place. Okay? On page 79. I want to look at page 79 for a second, because there was a thing I wanted to read on 79. Okay. Page 79, just about halfway down. This is, the narrator, O'Brien, talking, and he says, you can tell a true war story by the questions you ask. And, we're not going to analyze it too much right now, but if you think you can tell a true war story by the questions you ask, who is the you at the beginning and who is the you at the end? Who's telling, who's asking? It could go either way, right? If you're telling a story and you have a question about it, then that might help you understand if it's true. If you're listening and you have questions, the yous are ambiguous effectively, okay? You can tell a true war story by the questions you ask. Somebody tells a story, and afterwards you ask, is it true? And if the answer matters, you've got your answer. For example, we've all heard the one. 4 guys down a trail. 4 guys go down a trail. A grenade sails out. One guy jumps on it and takes the blast and saves his 3 buddies. Is it true? The answer matters. You'd feel cheated if it never happened. It sounds fake if nobody ever did that. Without the grounding reality, it's just a trite little bit of poetry, pure Hollywood. Untrue in the way all such stories are untrue. Yet, if it did happen, and maybe it did, anything's possible, even then it can't be true because true war stories don't depend on that kind of truth. Absolute occurrence is irrelevant. The thing may have been a total lie. Another thing may have happened and be truer than the truth. Pause. The fact that, he tells us a little thing. He says 4 guys are going down the trail. Grenade gets thrown in. One guy is the hero. He jumps on the hand grenade and he saves his buddies. If that's not a true story, then it is just fakey and romantic and made up, and it's like stupid. Yeah, like that's really going to happen. If it being true really matters, then it's not a true story, is what he's saying. I have to give you a quick example, because this is mythological. It's nobody really can tell anymore if this is true. World War I, the trenches, Christmas time, the Germans and the French and the British get up and they have the Christmas celebration out there in no man's land. Then they go back into the trenches over the next couple of days and start shooting at each other again. If you never heard that story, hopefully it isn't too quick to not make any sense. But World War I, they're in the trenches and they're there for literally years, shooting at each other. Nobody's making any progress. And then at Christmas, they all get up and have Christmas together. They play soccer, they have turkey, whatever. Then they go back into the holes and they try killing each other again, right? Is that a true story? I don't know. If it's not a true story, then it's like Hollywood. I mean, it's fake. But if that was true, that'd be pretty impressive. That'd be pretty weird. It would be like some strange, surreal, it'd be like the Twilight Zone. The fact that it matters is what makes it, in his evaluation, sort of a worthless story. Because if it hinges on it being true, yeah, what good is it? Now, right off the bat, that sounds like that doesn't make any sense. But now let's read the rest of the paragraph. He says, another story can be truer than truth. For example, 4 guys go down a trail. A grenade sails out. One guy jumps on it and takes the blast. But it's a killer grenade, and everybody dies anyway. And before they die, though, one of the dead guys says, "The fuck you do that for?" And the jumper says, "Story of my life, man." And the other guy starts to smile, but he's dead. Now, that's a true story. That never happened. So what's true about it? The true way that human beings are interacting, the true futility of being a hero, the true understanding of how screwed up your life can be or how irrelevant your life can be, the true misunderstanding of what would be helpful at that moment, the fact that it's not, pardon the phrase, a Disney World where things go all beautiful, that's what makes it true. If it has to be true in order to make a difference, then what the narrator is saying, that's not the author. If it has to be true to make a difference, then go and watch Disney movies. Go and see some princess who has a body that can't be physically humanly possible, right? I mean, that's basically what he's saying. Yeah. Seems to me anyway. The communication, he says, and again here he's talking about the point isn't what's going on in the story, it's like the telling of it, okay? The communication is in the act of telling and listening. That the fact that storytelling is more important than the story being told. The fact that he's telling us stories and we're listening to him is more important than the fact that it's the Vietnam War. We've said that before. So it's the telling that's important, because that's what's going on in his head. That's the important thing. That's what's happening, is he's telling a story. We said the story was sort of disturbing, and including the letter to Lemon's sister. When Rat Kiley wrote the letter to the sister, he says, Lemon was this awesome guy, and he was so awesome we'd like kill thousands of fish at once, or with hand grenades, or he was so awesome like he'd strip naked and go trick-or-treating in the villas and like freak out the natives, and he's so awesome like that's awesome. Well, for that experience, that's the spicy part. It wasn't that he was a good guy, it's that he was an important guy, and that's where the love story idea comes in. This wasn't a war story, it was a love story. So and this fits perfectly with what we've been saying so far about the author, about the narrator. In a chapter called How to Tell a True War Story, the story that he tells is so true, it's not even a war story. He tells us a love story. He says right here, it wasn't a war story, it was a love story. But he tells us that story in the chapter where he's talking about how to tell a true war story. It shows you how relevant the story is. It's the telling that's relevant. Okay, that's the important part. Okay, so this chapter, this is just some sort of little notation in the end. This chapter is really, you put this together with Spin, and you really get the author's character, the narrator's understanding of stories. This is just a bit of stylistic thing. This is the way repetition occurs in this chapter and in other chapters. He does the lists of things they carried earlier on, and here what he does when his form of repetition, because repetition is a big O'Brien thing, because since he's telling the story, it's like he's retelling it each time. Lemon dies like 5 times in this story. There are 5 different accounts of him dying. If you go back to the first story, it's the same thing with Lavender. I don't remember how many there, but he gives these lists of what people are carrying, and then inside of all that, Lavender dies. You hear that he's dying, that he's going to die, and then you see him die, and then you hear more about him dying, and then you see him die again. That repetition, it's retelling of the same story. Lemon dies, like I say, 5 times here. And then at the end, it seems like we get sort of a self-analysis from the narrator of why he's retelling that, why Lemon dies 5 or 6 times. And that's on page 80. Okay. On page 80, the last time, does he even die on this page? Well, he talks about him dying on this page. So, and this is that middle paragraph on page 80. The author, the narrator, the mixed voice says, 20 years later, and I can still see the sunlight on Lemon's face. I can see him turning, looking back at Rat Kiley. And then he laughed, and he took that curious half step from the shade into the sunlight, and his face suddenly brown and shining. When his foot touched down, in that instant, like when he hits the detonator or hits the booby trap, because it's a booby trapped shell, he must have thought it was the sunlight that was killing him, because he's just stepping out into the sunlight, click, boom. That's the last thing he experienced, was the sunlight. He must have thought the sunlight was killing him, he says. Okay. It was not the sunlight. It was the rigged 105 round. But if I could ever get the story right, how the sun seemed to gather around him and pick him up and lift him in high into the tree, if I could somehow recreate the fatal whiteness of that light, the quick glare, the obvious cause and effect, then you would believe the last thing Kurt Lemon believed, which for him must have been the final truth. If I could just say it right, I could tell his story. I could recreate the feeling he had. I could communicate that, and then you could hear it. Not that you normally matter that much to him, but if I could tell it right, then I would accomplish something. If I could just tell it right, and he tells it over and over, and it's kind of like, it's like he stepped into the sun. He must have thought, the flash of the sun and a flash of the body. So I went right at that moment. He must have been. It must have seemed right. So, questions or comments about that cool/intense story? I mean, you already had some comments about it, but any others? Well, in that case, I will send you off to read the two more short stories, 10 pages. This one is, it says we're going to hear a very personal story about the narrator. Okay. Again, it's a war story. There are dead people in it and things. But just so you know, the narrator is in this one. And part of what we're doing when we read this one is we're looking at how the narrator is created. This is an interesting narrative voice pair of stories. There are two versions of the story, and they're both sort of short, but compared to the like one sentence versions of Lemon's death we hear over and over, they're actually pretty long then. But go ahead and read these two stories or listen to them online. That's fine. You'll hear the same personal story, two different ways. You'll hear two different ways. And there's a writing question I want you to look at. Okay, and that's 005. It's got a question. If I'm not mistaken, the question should be phrased exactly the same for both stories, which now should make sense. You can ask the exact same question about both of these stories and get completely different answers, right? So I'd like you to go off and do the reading, those two stories, respond to 005, the two paragraphs, okay? And then submit that to Turnitin, not to Schoology. I'm actually going to go make sure that the Schoology Dropbox is closed on that. I wanted to go to Turnitin, which brings us back to, if you still haven't gotten into Turnitin, now's a good time to get it, right? So, questions or comments or ideas that I or anyone else in the room should hear before you all go away? Because if there ain't nothing, if everyone has stopped thinking, then you can wave at me on your way out the door and make sure you punch in to the attendants so I can verify that these people are those people. Okay? Rock and roll. See you later. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Don't have to come back. Yep, you don't have to come back.